in the West, you get a certain reaction when you say Margaret Thatcher because she is so detested by the people other than those on the right and the people who happen to admire her. She was a highly divisive right-wing leader in Britain in the 80s. She was pioneering Reaganism before Reagan. Even saying her name evokes a pretty tough mental image. In Japan, it's different. The Japanese impression of Thatcher is more stylistic than policy and outcome. It's more about being a brave, bold, outspoken woman who did not need to be propped up by men and being an unapologetic right-winger. That's the mould that Takaichi is appealing to.
Japan is preparing for its first ever female Prime Minister. Sanae Takaichi, the 64-year-old Conservative, likens herself to Margaret Thatcher as a would-be Iron Lady of Japan. And if her background as a heavy metal drummer is anything to go by, she'll be bringing plenty to the table. Today, political and international editor Peter Hartcher on what Takaichi's ascension could mean for China, Donald Trump's impact in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, Australia. Okay, Peter, so let's start with a primer on Japanese politics as things stand. Are the left or the right in power? What are the key issues? And where does the country take its place in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, Japanese politics is a bit of a puzzle to outsiders, and that's the reason it doesn't get a lot of coverage in the outside world, nowhere near as much coverage commensurate with its weight in the world. Part of the problem is that it seems to have had the same party in power, well, it has had the same party in power for the entire post-war era, with the exception of 6 years. So the question is it really a two-party system? Is it a democracy? How does this system function? So there are genuine reasons that people are puzzled by this system. The short answer to your question, Chris, is that it's the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party as they call it, is the centre-right party. One of the old gags about the Liberal Democratic Party is that it's neither liberal nor democratic, and it's not a party. It's conservative rather than liberal. They say it's not democratic because otherwise how could it hold power for the entire post-war era minus 6 years? And it's not really a party because it's been divided traditionally into very strong factions which compete amongst themselves for power. And that's part of the reason it has managed to hold power so long, because it has competing factions that can show competing faces to the public, can appeal to different constituencies, and it also helps explain why Japanese prime ministers change more often than most light bulbs, which is the factions share the spoils around, and typically a year or two is more than enough for the other factions to put up with. So that's the big picture. And it hasn't, Japan, for most of the post-war period, has not been a real two-party system. It was called a 1.5-party system, with the LDP, the centre-right, the current party, being the one party, even though it's divided among major factions, and the half party was the Socialist Party of Japan. And that provided the main competition against the LDP for most of that post-war era. But that's now faded away to almost nothing. In fact, in the last elections in Japan, the once dominant opposition party, the Japan Socialist Party, returned only one member of parliament with 2% of the vote. And there are more than 460 seats in the lower house of the Japanese parliament. And the Socialist Party, previously the leading opposition, now only has one seat. You asked what are the current setup and current issues. The problem that the LDP has now is that the competition isn't so much on the left, although there is a range of parties on the left of the LDP. The recent problem it's had is on the right, of the rise of minor right-wing, and in the Japanese spectrum, extremely right-wing political parties. One of them, the one that has had the most success, has been in recent years, has been modelling itself after Donald Trump's America First and calling itself Japan First, which gives you a hint to the sort of issues and questions which are on the table in Japan today.
Okay, so talk to me about Sanae Takaichi, who looks set to become Japan's first female prime minister. What's happened here?
Yes, what's happened is that the ruling party, the LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, has decided it needed to do something dramatically different. In the last year or so, it's lost its House majority. It's now ruling in a minority in a coalition in the lower house. And then in July, it lost its majority in the upper house as well. And it's been losing a lot of ground to minor right-wing parties. The Japanese public are frustrated with a few things, including the apparently endless corruption in the LDP, which has a time-honoured history of corruption. And it's frustrated with inflation. There's been an inflation uptick in Japan, even as it's been declining elsewhere in the world, in the Western world at least. The price of rice, for example, today is about double what it was a year ago, even after the government opened its strategic reserve of rice. And people are upset about the inflation, the corruption, and they're also upset. There's a sense of hopelessness, economic stagnation, an increasing number of foreigners and immigrants, in Japanese terms, a large number, in our terms, barely registerable, that is being blamed for that. And so the appeal of the right-wing parties that are more sceptical and xenophobic. So the LDP decided they needed to change. They needed to do something dramatic. And that brings us to Takaichi. So Takaichi's outstanding and most obvious feature is that she is Japan's first female prime minister. And for a country that's, pretty famously sexist and chauvinist, that is a standout all by itself. That is a remarkable day that it has happened. And she was chosen in an internal party ballot, LDP members. They had 5 candidates on the list. The other 4 were all blokes, and they chose her. And the reason is that in terms of the LDP, she is a hardline, right-wing conservative. Calls herself the Japanese Margaret Thatcher. And she appeals, the thinking is that she will appeal to a lot of the voters that have deserted the LDP to go to these more right-wing, further right-wing parties. She also has expressed some reservations about the scale and nature of the immigration and foreign resident program. She's socially very conservative, and she's also quite a hawk when it comes to foreign policy. So she's a much more right-wing, hard-driving and tough persona, as well as pretty conservative politics.
We'll come back to her politics in a moment, but Takaichi she's had a fascinating life, I think it's fair to say, from playing the drums to working in American politics in the 80s. Can you just talk the listeners through a bit more about this person's life?
Yeah, well, she's remarkable. First point is she's remarkable for being coming from an unremarkable family, just middle class, so factory worker and police officer parents. A lot of the LDP and a lot of the political class in Japan are sort of operating from a hereditary position where they inherit their seats from almost always their fathers. There's hardly any women in the LDP in parliament. A second, third, sometimes getting to 4th generation members of parliament. She had none of that. She had none of that entree. As you say, she's got obviously an adventurous spirit. In her youth, she was the drummer in a heavy metal band in Japan. And one detail that I noted in the piece I wrote about her, and that's widely commented, is that whenever she travelled to a gig, she would take multiple sets of drumsticks because she routinely broke them with the ferocity of her drumming, which tells you something. But also, as you say, she was a scuba diver, a car enthusiast, but perhaps in terms of Japanese women of her generation, she's 64 today, is that she was adventurous enough to go to the US and get a job on Capitol Hill, working for a Democratic congresswoman to see how the American system worked. Now, that is, in Japanese terms, an extremely adventurous, bold woman to do that, and she did it. So she's pretty functional on the international stage, and she's regarded as one of the very few members of the Japanese political system who might be able to meet Donald Trump eye to eye, because Japan and the US have a lot to talk about.
So as you say, she likens herself to Margaret Thatcher. One of her goals is to become Japan's Iron Lady, as it were. How is it that she seeks to model herself after Thatcher?
Yeah, in the West, you get a certain reaction when you say Margaret Thatcher because she is so detested by the people other than those on the right and the people who happen to admire her. She was a highly divisive right-wing leader in Britain in the 80s. She was pioneering Reaganism before Reagan. She was famous for her confrontation of the trade union movement. It ended in violent clashes, huge national schism. She posed as being a supporter and a champion of the free market, and yet under her term, the debt and deficit in Britain blew out enormously, so she was not successful there. So even saying her name evokes a pretty tough mental image. In Japan, it's different. The Japanese impression of Thatcher is more stylistic than policy and outcome. It's more about being a brave, bold, outspoken woman who did not need to be propped up by men and being an unapologetic right-winger. That's the mold that Takaichi is appealing to. And in Japan, it's pretty much unthinkable that she would bring on the social and economic confrontations that Margaret Thatcher herself actually conducted. So that gives you an idea of the mold that she wants to be without the same outcomes, I think.
Okay, so let's position her more in the Japanese context. You write that she most closely resembles her centre-right mentor, the late Shinzo Abe, of course, shockingly assassinated 3 years ago. Tell me more about her politics relative to the former Prime Minister.
So Shinzo Abe was a real standout in this sort of long line of bland LDP prime ministers who, as I said, might only get 1 year in the job, 2 if they were lucky. Abe managed to hold power over 2 terms for 9 years. He was remarkably effective, one of the only really effective prime ministers Japan has had in the last 50 years or so. One reason is that he was politically dominant. He was able to master the faction system and keep support broadly. But it was really his policy drivers that won him respect and that long tenure in Japanese politics of 9 years. The 2 things that he was noted for was reviving a long dormant economy at a time when the Japanese people had pretty much given up on any hope of economic revival, especially after the global financial crisis. He came in with a decisive so-called 3 arrows economic policy that was all about economic stimulus, and it worked. So that got him a lot of respect. The second big feature of his was his foreign policy. He was very outspoken and hardline in the Japanese spectrum of things about China and about North Korea. And he was very strongly aligned with the US and yet didn't appear to be sycophantic to the US at all. So this was a position that a lot of Japanese people could feel pretty proud about, although anxious about what it might mean for Japan's relationship with China. But it worked out pretty well. And these are the 2 predominant positions that Takaichi, who was one of his protégés, was a member of his group, his faction. She has now promised that she's going to replicate those policies and lead Japan out of its economic slowdown and lead Japan out of its fairly passive, in Japanese terms, recent foreign policy has been fairly active against the Chinese and North Korean threats, but she's promising now to take a much firmer line.
So talk to me a bit more about that, how she's differentiating herself, if you like, from her 2 predecessors and sort of reintroducing that harder line stance.
Yeah, the predecessors were a bit sort of amoeba-ish, sort of shapeless, formless, didn't really stand for much. They were time servers. They were seen as being weak on China and sycophantic to the US. Very much a contrast to Takaichi, and the main reason that a lot of the members of the LDP have chosen her to be their leader, that she will take a completely different position. So she, for example, with the US, she has said she's prepared to deal with Donald Trump as equals. I mean, this doesn't sound terribly drastic in the Western scheme of things, but in the Japanese scheme of things, this is pretty big. She said that the tariff deal that her predecessor had just negotiated with Donald Trump, she would be prepared to renegotiate if it turns out to be on unequal terms with Japan. So this is pretty strident stuff in the Japanese system. Remember that Japan has been, certainly the most stalwart ally of the US since World War II in Northeast Asia, and one of the 2 or 3 most stalwart in the world. So for a Japanese prime minister to say she's prepared to renegotiate a very fresh trade deal with Trump is bold stuff. And at the same time, she's taken unapologetically tough stances on China, to the point where she has said that the Japanese should host medium-range missiles, US missiles, on Japanese soil, and even have a debate about whether it should be the host nation for American nuclear missiles on Japanese soil in the event of a crisis. So these are tough positions that the Beijing government is quite anxious about.
Well, the timing is interesting here because Donald Trump, of course, is due to visit Tokyo in just a couple of weeks. Tell us a bit more about where Japan is with the tariffs at the moment and what we might expect to see between the two of them during that meeting.
The tariff story with Japan is that Trump has given Japan what he considers to be a very concessional tariff rate of 15%, in return for which Japan promised to invest more than $800 billion in the US economy. That's the bare bones. And given that Japan has had an enormous trade surplus with the US for almost the entire post-war era, it's actually a fairly concessional arrangement in Trump's worldview, and that's where things stand. So they've got a lot of brownie points, in other words, for being an important ally. And if the US is ever going to be serious about confronting China, Japan is at its very front row. It is the tip of the spear if there is a war against China, whether it's over Taiwan or something else. So for those reasons, it seems that Trump has cut a relatively straightforward deal with Japan. Trump put out a very gracious congratulatory note, calling her an impressive and strong woman, and she's been gracious about him. But they've got a few things to talk about. The tariff deal is one, China is another, and the personal chemistry between Trump and a strong woman, well, we'll see how that goes.
Okay, so we have Takaichi positioning or repositioning Japan politically, some pretty important alliances you discussed with the US, her position on China. How about Australia? How might a Takaichi prime ministership affect Australia's interest in the region?
A guidepost here would be Shinzo Abe, her former mentor, now assassinated, as you said. In his worldview, the response to the rise of an assertive China was very much about drawing closer to all like-minded countries. He pioneered the policy of a free and open Indo-Pacific. That was his term, which has since been embraced by the US, Australia, and everybody else. And part of that was working much more closely with Australia. Australia as a valued part of the coalition of countries that were prepared to stand with the US and against China. So Abe thought Australia was very valuable. I spoke to a Japanese commentator, a career diplomat who's now a conservative commentator in the Japanese media, Shingo Yamagami. And he told me that he has been advising Takaichi on foreign policy, one of many advisors, and he said that she puts a very high priority on Australia's strategic value, and that's to do with Australia's closely interlocked defence and national security cooperation with the US. It's got to do with Australia's membership of the Quad, which was another Abe innovation, to bring the leaders of those four countries, the US, Japan, India, Australia together. That was an Abe initiative, which is in a little bit of trouble at the moment because of tensions with Donald Trump continuously punishing India and the Indians not loving it. So Takaichi has vowed to re-energize the Quad. All of these are policies which would suit and fit the Albanese government pretty well. And according to Yamagami, the former Japanese ambassador to Australia, now commentator, he says that she does indeed, in his conversations with her, place a strong emphasis on an ever closer relationship with Australia.
Finally, Peter, you describe Japanese society as still relatively sexist. You use the word chauvinistic. Is Japan actually ready for its first female prime minister?
Yeah, on the face of it, it's a pretty tricky proposition when you consider that on the World Economic Forum's ranking of how successfully countries are closing the gender equality gap, Japan is way down the list. I think it's number 118 on their index out of 140-something countries. So it doesn't look good on the face of it. And if you've spent time in Japan and sampled the social structure there, you know that's not a bad reflection. But Takaichi seems to have overcome a lot of those reservations. Partly, I suppose, it's just her nature, her personality that people are responding to. I think it's also a sense of being fed up with the status quo. The LDP is very much, as we were discussing earlier, the party of the status quo. Almost everything that modern Japan does and represents has been built by the LDP, and people are sick of it. They're sick of the stagnant incomes. They're sick of the corruption in the party. They're sick of inflation and cost of living problems. They're sick of an increasing number, an increasingly obvious number of foreign workers, because Japan, of course, is an incredibly fast aging society and losing population. And the alternative is to bring in foreigners to help do the work. And people are sick of all of these things and want change. And she seems to have transcended the gender barrier by presenting the face of change. So among the 5 candidates for the prime ministership within the LDP in the last week, where she triumphed, she was rated number 1 by the Japanese public in opinion polling. So she seems to be the person who is resetting the odds on sexism and the role of women in Japanese society.
Well, Peter, it'll be fascinating to see how her prime ministership unfolds. Plenty to talk about in future, no doubt, perhaps over an okonomiyaki. Thank you for joining us in the meantime.
Okonomiyaki pancake, always welcome in my book. Thanks, Chris.